Everybody hear that question about Iran? Okay. If you look at the project for the New American Century documents on the web, just put PNAC, you can see the whole game plan. It was all laid out 10 years ago. And Iraq was first, and then Lebanon, and then maybe Syria or Iran. It's all kind of ideologically and strategically in a visionary document there laid out. The preparations, the military preparations, are pretty much been taken. The Air Force is ready to go. As some of you probably know, some of the Navy ships, including a carrier task force, is on its way to the Persian Gulf. That's being described as a rotation, but if the other aircraft carrier forgets to rotate, then we've got another serious signal. So my colleagues in Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity believe that the president will probably attack Iran, with or without the Israelis, before the end of his term. There's a small group of us, myself included, that think it 50-50 proposition that he'll do it before this election. Why? Because he needs something desperately. It's risky. It could just be counterproductive. But look at him. He's got all these things going on. His numbers are really low. He sits around with Rove and with Cheney, and they say, well, just let's strategize here. If the Democrats take the House, you're going to be impeached. I know Nancy Pelosi is saying, oh, we won't impeach? We won't impeach. But John Conyers, he'll wait a decent interval. In January, February, he's going to impeach you, Mr. President. And maybe the Senate won't convict you, but it's going to be 2 years of purgatory, if not hell. And they'll head up all the committees, and they'll be investigating it. And there's lots to investigate. We all know that. And not only that, but they might reverse this law that holds you harmless for violating the War Crimes Act, for example. The U.S. War Crimes Act, U.S. Code 2441, criminal law, passed by the Newt Gingrich Republican-dominated Congress in 1996, which connects U.S. criminal law inextricably to Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. In other words, it's not only dissing international law, it's U.S. criminal law that the president, on the poor advice of the vice president's lawyer and Gonzalez, violated. And we can see it. You can download the documents, PDF forms, see them exactly as they went to the president, as they came from the president, including the document in which he authorized torture. So anyhow, the stakes are very large. They could say, Mr. President, we can't be sure that if after your 2 years, you might be prosecuted for violating the War Crimes Act, or the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or the Fourth Amendment. There's lots of stuff that he could be prosecuted for. So the stakes are high. How are we going to get your numbers up? There's no obvious way that I can think of except you get the president to be a war president again, a wider war, where he could get up and say, well, I don't think you should really pull the rug out from under me now. We're involved in this wider war. Please don't vote for a bunch of Democratic wusses who are not going to pursue this war to its fruition, to victory. Now, is that likely? I give it a 50-50 chance. My colleagues, most of them think most likely after the election. But it's a real possibility. And how will they justify it? Justify it because Iran is a threat to Israel, our ally Israel. Everyone here knows that we have a treaty of alliance with Israel, right? Who doesn't know that? Ah, good. Welcome to the club. Can you say a word about that? Or?
I just didn't know we had a treaty of alliance with Israel. Now I take it we don't.
Yeah, we don't. Isn't that interesting, guys? The president keeps referring to our ally Israel. Actually, the president refers to our alliance with Israel, and there isn't any. Now, I used to think that that was a pretty smart move on our part, because who wants to get automatically involved in wars in the Middle East? And who wants to tick off the Arab countries even more than we already have, right? But guess what, folks? That's not the reason there's no alliance with the Israelis. We offered them an alliance, 1967, right after the war. And they said, thanks, but no thanks. Why? Because alliances require internationally recognized boundaries. And the last thing the Israelis wanted to talk about after having occupied the West Bank and Gaza were international recognized boundaries. Besides that, alliances involve mutual obligations to consult before you go taking off after another country, and the Israelis didn't want that either. So you're an Israeli policymaker now, and you're sitting up in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and you're sitting pretty, aren't you? I mean, you got your cake and eating it too. You don't have any obligations under this alliance, but you have the President of the United States telling all his people that we're allies. Not only that, but that the U.S. is duty-bound to come to our defense if we're threatened, which is precisely what the President has said. Wow, you know, what a great situation to be in. Well, that's the situation, folks, and it's really, really strange. And you can't say these things in polite company back there in Washington because you'll be called a traitor, terrorist, wuss. Oh, now you guys really, this is a different culture. You'd be called anti-Semitic is what you'd be called. Yeah. And that's really, that's, you know, and I have been. I mentioned it at the John Conyers Downing Street memo meeting that he had at the basement of the Capitol. And within 3 hours, 3 of those congressmen, Democrats, issued a joint statement saying that I was anti-Semitic, that I was completely off my rocker for suggesting that Israel had anything to do with our decision to make war against Iraq. 5 hours later, Howard Dean, chair of the Democratic Party, had to come back in the office, see it was live on C-SPAN, okay, and signed a similar letter. The Washington Post excoriated me the next day as being anti-Semitic. It's really very sinister. I mean, I know what anti-Semitism is. One of our VIPS people worked for the FBI infiltrating hate groups, you know, and he's told me what anti-Semitism is. And for somebody to throw that label at me gets me very, very angry. So, you know, but that you have to take that into account. I'm not running for anything, and I don't need any money, so I'm freer than most to talk about this issue. One thing some of you know is that 2 very courageous professors, a fellow named Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago and Waltz from Harvard University, got together and put together a pamphlet-sized study. It's about 50 pages. It's called The Israel Lobby, and it's full of things that you don't see in the media in this country. It's just a factual representation of how much power the Israel lobby has among legislators and media and every other part of society in this country. And in the foreword they say, we probably won't be able to get this published in this country, and sure enough, it had to be the London Times to publish it. And they said, we're also going to be criticized for being anti-Semitic. Sure enough, they really got hit pretty hard with that. But it's out there, and I read it, and it's quite responsible. I think it goes over a little bit too much in giving too much credit for the Israeli factor in our decision to invade Iraq. I think there were imperial factors in oil and, you know, strategic bases as well as Israel. I think Israel was an important part of it. But, you know, as I finished reading that, I said, well, these guys are really going to be criticized for this, but they didn't even mention the worst of it. And the worst of it, in my opinion, is the USS Liberty. Now, how many of you have heard of the USS Liberty? Okay, a couple. This was a U.S. naval warship that was off the coast of Israel during the 1967 war. It was an intelligence collector, and it was collecting signals not only from the Russians in Cairo and elsewhere, the Egyptians, but also the Israelis. The Israelis knew it was there. It was in international waters the whole time. But on June 8th, in broad daylight, some Israeli aircraft reconnoitered the USS Liberty, saw the great big American flag, went back. 2 hours later, Israeli fighter bombers came and did their best to sink it. Then torpedo boats came and tried to sink it. 2.5 hours, the battle raged. Finally, the ship limped back to port in Malta. They didn't sink it. Now, the first thing that those who survived, 34 US sailors were killed. 171 were severely injured. And when the ones that made it back woke up the next morning, they were visited by US naval officers of superior rank and told, if you so much as mention that the Israelis did this deliberately, even to your wife, you're subject to court-martial. We learned that during the battle, one of the Navy fellows on the Liberty was able to get in touch with the 6th Fleet headquarters, and the commanding admiral sent fighter bombers to do battle with whatever was attacking the USS Liberty. Halfway there, they were called back by order of the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, and Secretary McNamara. The whole thing was covered up. Now, why, you ask me, would the Israelis want to do something like that? 3 reasons. One I'm sure of, and that is that the Israelis were about to go up on the Golan Heights, take those heights from Syria. They had promised us that they wouldn't do that. They just didn't want us to know about it beforehand. There was no way that they could do that without communicating with their forces up there. They knew we would intercept the communications, and so they didn't want that to happen. Secondly, they had just captured about 1,200 Egyptian soldiers in the Sinai. They had asked them to dig their own graves, and they shot them. Thirdly, they thought that we were communicating with the Egyptians using one of the CIA stations in the Middle East, with the Liberty actually intercepting the initial message. That was wrong. That wasn't happening, but they thought it was. So those were the 3 reasons why they tried to sink the ship. Now, what's my point here? My point here is simply this, that this was suppressed by Congress, by the executive, by everybody. The Navy bristled, but it kowtowed and allowed this thing to be suppressed for many years. More recently, Admiral Thomas Moorer, who at one point was our the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did his own inquiry and got some of the Navy lawyers who had been asked to lie to come forward and admit what had happened, and now it's pretty much out in the open. Amy Goodman had it on her show. But it's not well known to the American people. So here I am just finishing reading this very scholarly study of the power of the Israel lobby, and I'm saying, my goodness, he didn't even mention the Liberty. Now, I don't know why they didn't mention the Liberty, but it seems to me that in 1967, the Israelis learned that they could literally get away with murder, and that not even if they killed 34 of our sailors would we object. And that's a very parlous kind of alliance to have, if you want to call it an alliance. It's the kind of entangling alliance that George Washington warned about, where the perceived needs of one party are automatically accepted as the perceived needs of the other. That's kind of a long-winded answer, but it's something that doesn't come out, but needs to, because the biggest problem in the Middle East right now is the way this president reversed the policy of 4 decades, where we tried to play the role of an honest broker between the Palestinians and the Israelis. This president, at his very first National Security Council meeting on the 30th of January 2001, said, that's for the birds. We know who our friends are. We're going to go with Ariel Sharon. Anybody know Ariel Sharon? Colin Powell says, well, yeah, I know him, but you know, I don't know if you want to unleash Ariel Sharon. And the president says, that's all right, we've decided to do that. A little show of force is not a bad thing sometimes. We'll see what happens. Well, we've seen what happens, right? And you know, his Colin Powell, he's a Secretary of State, and this is the first he knows about this decision. Gives you an idea of how that regime is still run. I'm talking too much, please. What I see is a military that has also been corrupted. Those people have a star in there. You know, this wouldn't go for everybody, but most of them have already made so many compromises, so many salutings to things they didn't believe in, that it's hard for them to act any other way. Like take Colin Powell, for example. You know, he didn't have the courage to do what he knew was right, just because he got so used to saluting. And he had already have 5 stars. You know, maybe he was looking for a 6th star, but I don't know you can get a 6th star. So I'm not trying to be cynical here. I'm just trying to say that in the government as a whole, since about 1980, there's been a corruption of the people who want to just do a straight job, telling the truth, speaking truth to power. And that's been in all areas, in the CIA and the military and other organs of government. My friend Nick is from the State Department. And so that's really kind of a bad situation to be in. But as far as it pertains to the military, I see the generals just, if Rumsfeld said, go bomb Iran, yes sir, we'll bomb it. Now the colonels might not be real happy about that, but I don't see any possibility that they would do anything other than follow orders. Well, they would try to avoid that, and I'm afraid the way they try to avoid that is by using these mini nukes. Yeah, I kid you not. You know, if we go after Iran, and let's say all they do is put two divisions across the border into Iraq and cut off our supply lines, they'll have the equivalent of 100,000 hostages. You know, 52 or 53 hostages were enough there in the embassy. Now they'll have all these soldiers that we have between Baghdad and Kuwait. And what are we going to do? Send in reinforcements? There aren't any reinforcements. But we have these mini nukes, Mr. President, and they're really not much different from high explosive weaponry, and they're real precise, and the Air Force tells us we can put them right on target. And besides, you don't have any options, Mr. President. You don't want to do the draft, so nuke them. Now, I really and truly believe that we're as close to using nuclear weapons as at any time since 1962. And I was real close to 1962 because that was the year I went on active duty with the Army. And when I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, there were no weapons. There were no weapons to train with. This was November, early November of 1962. All the weapons were in Key West. They were ready to go after Cuba. And those, have any of you seen The Fog of War? Yeah. It's a really, really interesting thing, because the thing that it points out is that when they're having these discussions, they get a message from Khrushchev, a conciliatory message, okay? And then 2 hours later, they get a really hard-nosed message from Khrushchev. So they're sitting around, and to his credit, John Kennedy made sure that a Soviet expert was always there in the person of Llewellyn Thompson, a long-standing ambassador to Moscow. So he was always there in these deliberations. So this particular day, Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief, has got his B-52s all lined up and loaded with nuclear weapons, okay? And they're all considering, well, there's no alternative to just taking out Cuba and the Soviets if they mess into this. And what happens? Do you remember on the tape? What happens? Somebody speaks up. Llewellyn Thompson. And it's on the tape. I disagree, Mr. President. I disagree. Now, who would say that now? And you know, I disagree, Mr. President. I had lunch with Khrushchev a month ago. I think he's looking for a way to be let down easy. I think what we do is we answer the conciliatory message, ignore the hard-nosed one, because that was probably composed with his military looking over his shoulder, okay? And see what happens. JFK, to his credit, says, hold everything, Curtis, unload those planes. We're going to try what Llewellyn Thompson suggests. And you know the rest of the story. Now, why do I recount that thing? Because there ain't no Llewellyn Thompson around Washington anymore. And even if there were, he wouldn't be let anywhere near this president. And so that's really scary. That is scary. And the blithe way that they think they can do things, and it wouldn't have repercussions, especially with Iran, is scary indeed. Now, hopefully they won't do that, but some of us think there's an even chance they would try something like that before the election. I got another suggestion that they might try. I hope this is the one they pick. Iraq such a problem? Well, we're going to give Don Rumsfeld a, what's that highest award? Presidential Medal of Freedom. Yeah, the one that the head of the CIA and Tommy Franks and that Paul Bremer, who messed up royally in Baghdad, but when they all got together, we're going to give him that medal and you know, give him a sinecure somewhere and bring in Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton, the Democrat, you know, the very respected Democrat, who, my friends, is a snake. You look at his record. Look at what he did at Iran-Contra. He fixes things. He fixes things, and he's willing to do the Republicans' bidding at virtually any turn. And so they would make him Secretary of Defense. It would look a lot better. And then the big thing would be the president would announce that he has a secret plan to get out of Iraq. Does that remind you of anything? Who else had a secret plan? Richard Milhouse Nixon had a secret plan how to get out of Vietnam. And this secret plan will be announced at the turn of the year because James Baker, who's heading up this big Iraq study group, will be reporting, and we'll have, you know, I hope that that's the way they go. I mean, that could convince a lot of Americans, but it'd be a lot better for our country than kind of bombing Iran. I mean, they have this concept that we are the sole remaining superpower in the world, and that we're able to put our military in any place we want. And what more important a place than in the Middle East, where all the gas and oil is, or most of it. And so since we can do that, we're going to go ahead and do that. And that's what makes me afraid about Iran. They don't seem to have any real, I mean, when the president was asked, was he concerned about his place in history? Do you remember what he said? He said, history, we'll all be dead. Now that's the attitude of an adolescent, or actually younger person. And that's, you know, if that's the way he looks at the world, then let me pass along one more moving experience that I've had in working around the country. Under the sponsorship of Code Pink, that imaginative and courageous group of women, several Iraqi women were invited to tour the United States in March of this year, International Women's Month. And I had the privilege of accompanying one of them with one or two others. Scott Ritter was with us. Her name was Faisa Al-Jarati, and we spoke in the Bay Area, sort of divvied up the U.S., and the Bay Area was our territory. Well, we had 3 nights running, speaking at various churches or big tall halls. And on the third one, we were down at Santa Cruz, which I'm told is about as liberal a place as you can find, even in California. And the people all reacted the same way when Faisa Al-Jarati explained what was happening to her people, to her children, to her nephews, you know, what was going on in Iraq. And they all were literally wringing their hands saying, oh, that's terrible, but what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? Well, in Santa Cruz, I'll never forget it, Faisa gave her a little spiel, poured out her heart, told about what was happening to her relatives and friends, and then she sat down next to me. I'm sitting over there, and my pad's there, and she goes, takes out her pen and she writes, so the American people feel sorry for Iraqi people, but American administration doesn't listen to American people. So what is key to helping my Iraqi people who are being killed and wounded? At the beginning of this meeting, I feel sorry for American people. But now, my people continue to die, And American people can only say stupid things like, oh, what can we do? I feel sick. And she puts that in front of me. Now, I'm old enough to know, to recognize a profound moment. And I said to myself, wow, this is pretty profound. That's what she wanted to say, but didn't. But I'm also old enough to realize I can't parse these things myself without some help, so I called some of the women that I work with at the Servant Leadership School in Washington. And I said, Victoria, how do you put this together? And she said, don't you remember when we took that racial sensitivity training, the Damascus Road, where the instructor looked at us and he said, look, you've got your foot on my neck, and I don't want to hear about how you didn't know that you had your foot on my neck, and I don't want to hear about how sorry you are about, I want you to get the foot off my neck, thank you very much. And she said, remember what else he said? How he looked at us, those of us who are white, and he said, you white people, you have no idea of the power that you have in that white knapsack of privilege. You have no idea of how you could use that for good if you would do one thing, and that is stick your neck out. Now, I've got nothing against necks, okay? They're convenient connections between head and torso. But if there is nothing for which you would risk that neck, then it has become your idol, and necks are not worthy of idol worship. And so I just think that the time has come where we have to all realize what we have come into us, or what we have sort of assimilated simply by virtue of our color, by our educations, by our upbringing, by our money, and stick our necks out, because it may be too late. This is when we have to do it. Let's not be like the obedient Germans in the 30s. We have to rise to this occasion. I don't know exactly how, but let's piece it together and do it. And thanks very much for your attention.